Buddhism emphasizes impermanence and insubstantiality. According to Buddhism, the world isn't a collection of separate things that occasionally interact with each other. Rather, the world is a confluence of processes, events, all of which are dependent upon other processes. The interesting question for us this evening is, what does this imply about Buddhism itself? If this must be true for Buddhism, then what kind of interaction can we observe going on now? How is it that Buddhism must change as it comes to the modern world? I mean, we can see the way Buddhism developed in Asia. Every time it went to a new culture, it didn't confront and challenge and try to conquer the local gods or the local religion, but rather it tended to interact. There was a kind of co-creation process going on. For me, the classic example is China. When Mahayana went to China, it interacted with the native Taoist religion. In fact, there was definitely a kind of a synchronicity or lots of resonances between them. And it was the result of that interaction that gave birth to Chan, or Zen Buddhism, which is what I've practiced in. Another example, of course, would be when Tantric Buddhism went to Tibet and interacted with the local Baron tradition there, leading to Tibetan Buddhism. But the really interesting question for us today is, okay, now that Buddhism comes to the West, or maybe we should say comes to the modern world, because that really extends beyond the West now. Buddhism comes to the West, it's not simply a matter that we in the West appropriate Buddhism, but we're still in the early stages of this incredible process of co-creation, interaction between the two. And what can we see is growing out of this interaction? Well, one example, of course, would be Buddhist-Christian dialogue, which has been very productive. But I think a far more intense example, and maybe this is the field where Buddhism is having the greatest impact so far, would be with psychology, especially Western psychotherapy. So we not only have lots of Western therapists who are Buddhist practitioners, but we also have a number who are themselves Buddhist teachers. And this is very exciting because Western psychotherapy itself is a very new discipline, still transforming, still finding itself, still developing very rapidly in many new directions. So this interaction with the Buddhist tradition, it's clearly there's something very important going on there. Early stages, we don't know yet what all it's going to lead to, but already the literature on Western psychology and Buddhism is really almost too great for anyone to master, so things are happening quickly. But it's another interaction that I want to focus on this evening, and it's the interaction that has come to be known as socially engaged Buddhism. The fact that Buddhism, as it comes to the West, or comes to the modern world, meets a tradition, originally the Abrahamic tradition, a tradition that is focused on social transformation in a way that Buddhism in Asia wasn't really able to do. And it's pretty exciting to see how the new possibilities opened up to the Buddhist tradition by its exposure to this alternative. It's very exciting to see what's beginning to develop out of that. And that's really what I want to focus on this evening. As a way of getting into the topic, let me seize upon the question of ethics or morality. What I'm especially interested here is not so much the content of ethics. I don't want to compare and contrast so much the specifics, say the 5 precepts or the 10 commandments of the Mosaic Decalogue. Rather, I'm interested in the different functions of morality within the Abrahamic traditions, that is to say, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and the Buddhist tradition, because I think there's a significant difference that has very important implications for this conversation, this development of socially engaged Buddhism. What do I mean by this? Well, let me spend a little time talking about the Abrahamic tradition and what I see as both the weakness and also the strength of what I see as the fundamental paradigm or the fundamental duality, the fundamental worldview, which has to do with the duality between good and evil. When we look at the Abrahamic traditions, we often talk about them as ethical monotheism. And we usually focus on the monotheism, one God. But I want to focus just as much on the ethical, because the real interesting question is, what is God's main relationship to us? How does God communicate, and what does he communicate? And the point, I think, it's fair to say, for all the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Talmud, the Christian Bible, the Quran, it's fundamentally a moral obligation. That is to say that God is telling us that we need to behave in certain types of ways, and we will be rewarded if we behave in those ways, and we will be punished if not. And this carries on all the way through. I mean, if we go back to the very beginning of human civilization according to the Bible and the Torah, the story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, clearly that's a myth about the origins of self-consciousness and the consequences of self-consciousness. But it's quite striking that it's told in terms of an act of disobedience against God. From the very beginning, we're talking about sin. And this carries on down. A couple chapters later, you get to the flood and Noah's Ark. Most people are destroyed. Why? Because they're not living according to the way that they should, according to God. Later on, the Mosaic Decalogue, the 10 Commandments given to Moses, again telling us what we should and shouldn't do. And even if you turn to Jesus, although he seems to develop a more intimate relationship with God, he talks about Abba, God the Father. Still, as we know, fathers can be pretty strict. Just because there's the unconditional love, there's nonetheless the emphasis we have to behave in a certain way. So this is the first point I want to make, is the emphasis on the moral imperative, the emphasis. This is really, I think, at the heart of the Abrahamic traditions, at least as they have been institutionalized, as they have become known to us. Right? But you might want to ask, well, why am I emphasizing that so much, given that many people today, and certainly many of the people in this room, probably don't believe in that kind of Abrahamic God or those kinds of commandments anymore. So what's the point of it? The point, I think, is that even though many people nowadays might reject the Abrahamic God, or they don't find the usual way of expressing that convincing, despite that, I think it still remains the fundamental paradigm, the spectacles, the worldview within which we tend to see the world. Think, for example, of the stories that we love so much. Think of mystery and murder novels. Think of TV shows. Think of our favorite films. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, James Bond. What's going on there? I mean, we love this story, the struggle between good and evil. It's deep within us, even for those of us who don't believe in the traditional God, the Father. That's still deeply ingrained. That's sort of our main spectacles, I think. And the reason I emphasize that is it's not only the case that we enjoy this story, but the fact that we actually continue to enact it, which is where I think we have both the strength and the weakness of this paradigm. Let me explain. The problem with this story, the duality between good and evil, the problem with this story from a Buddhist perspective is that it can be, and often is, an example of dualistic thinking. And dualistic thinking in Buddhism is problematic because it's delusive, or it's often delusive, and it causes suffering. In the Zen tradition, we talk about binding ourselves without a rope, just like William Blake talked about mind-forged manacles. It's ways of thinking that we get caught up in that cause problems for ourselves. And one of those is dualistic thinking. What do I mean by dualistic thinking? Often when we think dualistically, we make distinctions between the two because we want one and we don't want the other. And that's where the problem occurs, because it's the nature of dualistic thinking that you can't have one without the other. Because the true dualisms work that the meaning of each is the negation of the other, they have no meaning apart from each other. In fact, they're not really two separate concepts, but rather they're the two sides of the same concept. What am I getting at here? This is not only a philosophical, abstract problem, but it's also a very personal one. For example, supposing you decide that you want to live a pure life, however you understand purity. The problem of dualistic thinking rears its head here because what it means, of course, is that if that's really what's important to you, you are going to be preoccupied with impurity, right? You're going to have to be constantly worrying about situations, impure situations that you might fall into. And that simply has to do with the fact that purity has only meaning in relation to impurity, and vice versa. But of course, the more important example, the more pertinent one for right now, is the duality between good and evil. And here the problem, it's not only that we don't know what's good until we know what's evil, we don't know what's evil. It's not only that, but rather built into our usual understanding of what's good is the sense that the person who is good, we know that they're good because they're fighting against evil. Think of James Bond. Kind of a happy fellow, enjoys himself thoroughly. How do we know that he's a good guy? Really, how do we know? We know he's a good guy because he's fighting against the bad guys, right? I mentioned earlier that we not only enjoy these stories, but we continue to enact them. And I think this is a very important example for us today. I think the most recent and unfortunate instance of that might be the war on terror. What was the difference between Osama bin Laden and George W. Bush, really? Actually, they were mirror images of each other. They were both fighting the same holy war of good against evil. Each of them believed that he had the responsibility as a good guy to fight and destroy the bad guys. It's really the same war that they're fighting. It's just that what Bush believes is good, bin Laden believed was bad, and vice versa. But it was really a mirror image of the need for the good to destroy evil. And this is also showing us very clearly, I think, what's the problem with this duality. The last 10 years, the incredible suffering, the hundreds of thousands of people who've died, the fact that we are a nation that not only tortures people, but have actually, at some level, come to accept that it's okay to torture people if you think they might know something important. A real deterioration in our own moral fiber. The fact that there are more people now in the world who hate the United States than there were 10 years ago because of the way that we have responded to the Twin Towers attacks. What all this points to, I think, is the tragic paradox in the duality of good and evil, which can be expressed this way. One of the fundamental causes of evil in our world has been our attempts to destroy evil. And that's one of my main points, so I'll repeat it. One of the main causes of evil is our attempts to destroy evil. Think, if you will, of the example of Hitler, Adolf Hitler. What was he trying to do by destroying, killing so many Jewish people, so many homosexuals, so many gypsies, and so forth? Well, he was trying to purify the world, right? He was trying to get rid of the vermin, the evil elements, so he could have this pure world of Aryan race, for the Aryan race. What about Stalin? What was Stalin doing when he destroyed so many kulaks, the relatively wealthy peasants? That was necessary to create his ideal society of collective farms. And what about Mao Zedong in China, who did much the same thing with the landlords, the need to destroy the landlords in order to create a pure world, which is the whole idea behind the revolution. Even though you might think of all of these figures as in some sense secular, at least I don't think any of them would identify themselves as Christians, nonetheless, that same duality was still deeply involved in what it was that they were trying to achieve. And I think this shows us the problematical side of that dualistic way of thinking. But having pointed out the problematical side, I also want to emphasize what I think is so important about it, the positive other side of that duality, which goes back simply to something that I think originates with the Hebrew prophets. That is to say, one manifestation of this preoccupation with good and evil is the Hebrew prophetic preoccupation with social justice. What were the prophets doing? They were not just criticizing the people for not living as they should, but most importantly, they were criticizing, attacking the rulers. Why? Because they were not good rulers. They were exploiting people, the orphans and the widows and the poor. They were taking advantage of them. And the prophets like Amos and Isaiah, they would go around and they would say, "You are doing evil things. You will be punished by God for what it is that you do." This concern for social justice, at least in the Western civilization tradition, I think we can trace it back to this deep expression that goes back to the Hebrew prophets. But we also have to add something else. It's not only the Hebrew prophets that originate this, but we have to combine it with the Greek tradition and the beginnings of democracy that occurred in Athens. We sometimes trace back Western civilization to Athens and Jerusalem because it's the confluence, it's the combination of these two worldviews that really creates the modern world, I think. And my version of it is to see how we need to bring together the Hebrew concern for social justice with what the Greeks realized about the fact that we can change society. This is one of those things that we take for granted today, that it's hard for us to appreciate what a revolutionary insight this was. But as far as I can see, the Greeks were the first to have this tremendous insight that there's this fundamental difference between the natural world and human convention, human society. And the important difference is we can change human society. If we don't like the way that our society is structured, we can redo it. And of course, we're very familiar with this today. We're so familiar with revolutions, reform movements, laws. We're so familiar with it, we take it for granted. If our society has something wrong with it, we can change it. But that's not something that most ancient societies ever really understood. If you go back before the Greeks, if you go back to societies like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mayas, and Aztecs, for these people, of course, it's a big generalization, but in general, we can say that they were not aware that their society was significantly different than the ecosystems. It's like they took their social structures for granted in much the same way that they took their ecosystems. It was just all natural. One way to say it is that they didn't distinguish between the natural world, between the social structure, between the religion. It was just that's the way things were. The possibility that we could actually fundamentally change things, that was very novel, and that's very important, and that's why we trace Western Civ back to the Greeks. If you took a philosophy class, you probably read some Plato, Republic. One of the things he's doing in that, isn't he, is offering a new blueprint for a new society. We're familiar with dozens of blueprints. That is not news to us. But in the context of Athens, in the context of that time, that was pretty revolutionary. We know the Greek beginnings were not very satisfactory, very inadequate democracy for sure. But my basic point is, when you bring together the Hebrew concern for social justice, or the Abrahamic concern, let's say, for social justice, with the Greek realization that you can restructure society, what does this lead to? Well, it leads in the modern world to social revolution. It leads to the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. It leads to human rights. It leads to the Bill of Rights. It leads to anti-slavery campaigns. It leads to women's rights. It leads to gay rights. This whole emphasis that we can actually restructure society to make it a better one. And this is fundamental to what the Western tradition has achieved. It's the thing that we should, one of the things that we should be most proud of, most appreciative of. So you can see that I've pointed out both a problem with good and evil, but also, I think, the real strength, the concern for social justice that I think originates from that, from preoccupation with that duality. But I want to go a little bit more forward and just point out one more problem with this understanding, with this realization that we can transform society. Why does it so often happen that despite our best intentions, things don't work out very well? Why does it happen so often that one gang of thugs ends up being replaced by another? I wonder if Buddhism can help us understand this. If we focus only on the social structure and don't really pay attention to the challenge, the problem of individual transformation, then what it means, of course, is that the people, the revolutionaries, for example, who might take over, well, they still have their egos. They haven't really worked on themselves. They don't understand necessarily fully what's motivating them. If I haven't worked on my own greed, ill will, and delusion, my own ego, then when I'm in a position of power, what's going to happen? It's going to be very difficult to avoid the tendency to take advantage of it in some way. If I haven't come to grips with my own aggression and my own ill will, how am I going to respond to criticism, people who criticize me, people who seem to obstruct my plans? If I don't really have a handle on my own ego, the natural tendency is going to be, I will understand the basic problem as the need for me to impose my will on the situation. In other words, things aren't going to work out well enough. And of course, this applies not only to leaders, revolutionary leaders, but I think it applies to all of us, really. Democracy in itself is a great means, but it guarantees nothing if the people who live in a democratic society are still fundamentally motivated by their own greed, aggression, and delusion. Things are still going to go wrong. You can't create a social structure so perfect that people don't have to make an effort to be good. And that, I think, is what we are running up against. It's like we have had so many possibilities. We've had so many revolutions. We've evolved in so many ways. And yet we can see it hasn't really worked out as well as we could. And what I'm suggesting to you is because we haven't had the correlative realization that we have to work on our own personal transformation. Does this make any sense? Now let me turn to the other side, to Buddhism. As I said before, of course there is morality in Buddhism, but the basic point is that it doesn't function in quite the same way. I mean, we know in popular Buddhism, lay Buddhism, the precepts are very important. And if you convert to Buddhism, you'll probably not only take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, but you'll probably also take the precepts. But if we understand these precepts in a kind of Abrahamic or Mosaic way, we're going to misunderstand them. Because, of course, in Buddhism, there's no God who tells us to behave this way. The real point of the precepts is that if we live according to them, the quality of our life will change. That's really what it's about. Our way of experiencing ourselves and other people and the way that they relate to us will become different, will improve. In other words, in Buddhism, the precepts are not really commandments, but rather mindfulness exercises to train ourselves in a certain way. And yet, within the Buddhist tradition, the precepts are not the most important thing. Rather, if we want to pick out a duality, again, duality, a little dangerous here, but if we want to pick out a duality, the fundamental duality in the Buddhist tradition is what? It's the duality between delusion and wisdom, or if we want to say ignorance and awakening. That's the fundamental duality for Buddhism. And the duality of good and evil plays a function in our development of ourselves, but this is the one that basically has to be solved. Just to back this up in some of the Buddhist teachings, in the Brahmajala Sutta, which is one of the most important suttas of all, in fact, it's the first one in the Digha Nikaya and the long scriptures. In that sutta, the Buddha says twice, he distinguishes, quote, trifling matters, things of little value, mere morality, from what he calls, quote, other things profound, difficult to realize, comprehensible only to the wise, things that he has realized. So the primary challenge we face with in the Buddhist tradition isn't ethical, but I guess we could call it cognitive, except it's not just intellectual in the usual sense. It has to go much deeper than that. For Buddhism, the ultimate goal is to wake up, which is, of course, the meaning of the word Buddha, right? The Buddha is the awakened. We're not yet awake, we're in effect dreaming, and we are challenged to wake up. And in principle, at least, when we do, the idea of an external moral code that we have to follow disappears. From the perspective of awakening, it turns out that morality, such as the 5 precepts, they're like the training wheels in a bicycle that little children use when they start learning how to ride a bike. Once you know how to ride a bike, you can take them off. You don't need them anymore. And within the Buddhist tradition, once you're awakened, at least in principle, you don't need those precepts because you are not inclined to violate them, because having realized your true nature cuts through whatever inclination you might have to violate them. Because, here's one way to say it, if waking up involves realizing this non-duality, that David Loy isn't in here looking at the world out there, but that David Loy is all of you, or one of the ways in which all of you come together right here and now. In principle, I have to keep saying in principle because there are so many examples where it doesn't seem to work very well, does it? We know so many teachers who don't seem to really live in a way that we think they should. But in principle, if one's experience, if one's realization, awakening is deep enough, one naturally wants to live in a way that doesn't violate the precepts. Because we're no longer inclined to abuse others because we don't experience them as other. We experience them as aspects of ourselves. Now, so where does the Abrahamic, the Western emphasis on social justice fit in here? Well, that's the point. It really doesn't. Buddhism doesn't talk about social justice. There's really nothing comparable. I think the closest might be something like karma, but in fact, that's completely different, isn't it? The whole notion of karma, as normally understood, is that justice is built into the fabric of the cosmos, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. It'll take care of itself, which is very different from what something like the Hebrew prophets were talking about, right? Instead of justice, instead of good and evil, what Buddhism emphasizes is, and this is the most important term, I think, in the whole of the Buddhist tradition, is dukkha, the word that's usually translated into English as suffering. Although it only works if you understand suffering in the broadest sense, as referring to a kind of basic dissatisfaction, frustration, dis-ease, really meaning our manifest inability to live happily for very long, right? This is what Buddhism emphasizes. The interesting question, though, historically, is the kind of dukkha that the Buddha emphasized, is it only the dukkha having to do with the way we think, the way that we individually understand and live? Or is it perhaps the case that we shouldn't make a distinction between the kind of individual dukkha that we try to address with our personal transformation and social or collective or institutionalized dukkha? Did the Buddha mean our own individual suffering, or did he perhaps have a wider social vision? Did he perhaps intend to provide a kind of new paradigm for even a new kind of civilization? Some scholars have argued that. People like Trevor Ling and more recently Nayland Swarus, They don't think that the Buddha was trying to create a new religion. In fact, we have to be very careful not to project our modern understanding of religion back upon the Buddha. Our understanding is largely a result of the Reformation. We, as a result of that and the importance of having religious freedom, different religions, we emphasize different aspects, different, what would you call them, spheres of life. So we have the economic sphere, the political sphere, maybe the artistic sphere, and the religious sphere. But we tend to separate them in this way. But it's not at all clear, especially given how little we actually know about the time of the Buddha, it's not at all clear exactly what the Buddha's broad vision was. What is clear is we know what happened to the tradition. We know what happened to Buddhism as it became institutionalized. And I think this is where we can see the problem setting in. What happened pretty quickly after the Buddha died was that Buddhism became institutionalized. The monasteries became very important. The monks tended to settle down into them. And not only that, but Buddhism had to come to an accommodation with the state. That is to say, with the rulers, the kings, the emperors. In order for Buddhism to survive and thrive in Asian societies, none of which were democratic, by the way, this is one of the essential points. In order for Buddhism to survive and thrive in those societies, it had to have support, or at least toleration, and it was usually more than that. It was usually a lot of support, material support, from the kings and so forth. If the rulers didn't like what the Buddhists were getting up to, they could squash the monasteries and the monks, and of course they sometimes did. In other words, there was this importance of an accommodation. And since none of these Asian Buddhist societies was democratic, it therefore meant that Buddhism never had the opportunity to develop the wider implications of the Buddhist emphasis on dukkha, you see. It couldn't challenge the dukkha caused by the state, caused by the ruler, the exploitation of the poor people that the ruler was engaged in doing. And again, none of these rulers were very democratic. One exception, Ashoka, doesn't really change things here. So what happened instead is that in order for Buddhism to get along and to thrive, in order to get the support that the monasteries needed, well, you know, if you want the ruler to rub your back, you have to rub his back, right? If you want to get support from the ruler, you have to support the ruler in some way. And unfortunately, this was very easy to do by, I think, misapplying the whole notion of karma. The king, very powerful, rich person, well, in order for him to be reborn as a prince who takes on that role, he must have had very good karma in his past lifetime, right? And what about the poor people, the wretched ones? And let's include, of course, women, people born as women. Well, you obviously had very bad karma in your past lifetime. But don't blame anyone else. What you have to do is behave yourself, do what me men tell you, and if you do a good job of that, you have a chance of being reborn as a man in your next lifetime. I'm exaggerating, I'm travestying a little bit, but only a little bit. Unfortunately, the karma doctrine, at least as usually interpreted, lends itself to this kind of misappropriation. I don't think it's what the Buddha was talking about. In fact, we can point to things in the Pali Canon that make it clear he wasn't talking about this. But nonetheless, over time, this is what happened as Buddhism became institutionalized. In other words, and this is my important point, whatever vision the Buddha may or may not have had about dukkha, suffering, and how that can be addressed and relieved, whatever vision they may have had, the way the Buddhist tradition developed, it had to focus only on our individual dukkha, our individual ways of thinking, our own suffering, and therefore Buddhism developed this wonderful, the world's greatest collection of meditative, contemplative practices in order to help us achieve personal enlightenment, overcoming our own personal individual dukkha. But the consequence, of course, is that Buddhism in Asia had no political thrust, or very, very little. It couldn't challenge the authorities. Do you see my point? Can you see the contrast between the two traditions? Basically, what I'm trying to say is the Western tradition has emphasized social transformation, institutional transformation, but as important as that's been, and we're certainly here all beneficiaries of this, we can also see the limitations, because that in itself can't really work completely because of the problems with individual egos, with individual greed, ill will, and delusion always tending to get in the way if we don't have an appreciation for the importance of personal transformation, right? Then we go to the other side, and we have Asian Buddhist societies, none of which was democratic. And in those societies, Buddhism develops this wonderful panoply of practices and teachings to help us overcome our egos, to help us overcome our greed, ill will, delusion, and awaken. But by the constrained political, social context of that world, Buddhism couldn't say anything about institutionalized dukkha. And it's only in our time, and I think none too soon, because I really think we are in a state of crisis where we're going to need, I think the crisis of the West, the crisis of the modern world, is not just of particular institutions or distributive justice, whatever. It's a crisis with the paradigm. And in order to succeed, what I think we're going to have to do is bring together these two paradigms. I think that Buddhism has a particular worldview, a particular understanding that offers what the West lacks. And likewise, I think that the Western tradition, the emphasis on social transformation, offers possibilities for Buddhism that couldn't be developed before. And it's the coming together of the two in our time, in this time of great crisis, that is what I think is so exciting. And this is one of, I think, the major sort of intersections, the major co-creations, where it's not a matter of choosing between the two worldviews. It's not a matter that we have to have one and not the other. Rather, I think we can see the importance of both, how they really not only fit together, but I think each provides what the other lacks, which is perhaps the main point that I want to make this evening. I suppose we could summarize it all just in terms of freedom, right? That the emphasis of the Western tradition has been on institutionalized freedom, freedom from the state. Think of the Bill of Rights, for example. One could argue that the main development of the West has been this concern for social, economic, political freedom, although we certainly have our problems. On the other side, the Asian tradition, particularly Buddhism, I think has been so wonderful at pursuing what might be called psychological or spiritual freedom. And I think today we can see the limitations on both of those freedoms if they are pursued by themselves. That in order to be more fully realized, we have to bring them together. So it's not a matter of choosing between them. And that brings me back to that quotation from Gary Snyder that you might have seen on the poster, something he actually wrote in an essay exactly 50 years ago, 1961. He put it very beautifully. The mercy of the West has been social revolution. The mercy of the East has been insight into the basic self. It's the self-void, the voidness of the self, we could say. And then he concludes, we need both. Does this make any sense? Is this... I better glance at the clock. I would like to spend a few more minutes giving an example of how these two could inform each other by talking about our economic situation. And I'll try to keep it brief because I can see time is getting on. But I think that the Buddhist perspective, in at least two ways, offers us a fresh way of understanding our economic situation. Again, not a way that replaces Western perspectives, emphasis on social justice and fairness, but rather it gives us a different insight into what the problem is with our economic situation, an insight that may help us avoid superficial solutions that in the long run won't really solve the problem. Let me try to explain. So I'd like to point out two related implications of Buddhist teachings for economics. The first focuses on our individual relationship with economics, consumerism, for example, our own personal involvement with the economic system. But then there's the other one, briefly, I'd like to turn it around and look at it from the institutional side and ask what light Buddhism might be able to shed on the particular kind of economic system that we have today. In order to do this, though, it requires me to go back to what I think is the fundamental teaching of the Buddha. I say that because if I had to pick out one claim, one particular thing that the Buddha said, this is what I would focus on as most important for us today. It's the link between dukkha, which we already talked about, suffering, and the sense of self. So Buddhism has this strange, counterintuitive that there is no self. What's going on here? Today, I think, thanks to Western psychology, we have some advantages that can help us understand what the problem is. In contemporary terms, we can see, I think, pretty clearly that the sense of self is a psychological and social construct. We know so much now about child psychology. We see that happens. What's the interesting question from a Buddhist standpoint is, why is it that this sense of self is so deeply infected by dukkha? That is, Buddhism seems to be saying that it's the nature of the sense of self to suffer. And why is that? And this, I think, is the critical point. Well, what is the sense of self composed of? Mostly habitual ways of thinking, feeling, acting, reacting, remembering, planning, intending. It's really the way that these mostly repetitious ways of thinking and also the actions associated with them, it's the way that these work together that they create the sense of a self that's inside. And the important point here is the problem of self is also the problem of other. That the construction of a sense of self inside, the feeling that I'm in here somehow behind the eyes, inside the ears, or so forth, and that the rest of you are out here, that you are objective to me, other than me. This is the sense of duality that I think that the Buddha is criticizing as delusive and as fundamentally always so basically uncomfortable. And why? Well, I think we can see that if the sense of self is really not a thing but a process, it's the way that these habitual tendencies work together, then the sense of self is not a thing, like Buddhism says. There's nothing substantial about it. It has no reality. There's nothing there that could become real. We could say that the sense of self is not only groundless, but inherently ungroundable, and therefore inherently insecure. As long as we have the delusion of a separate self, there's the feeling that I'm a thing, but I can't know what this thing is, and I can never secure it. One way to say it is to say that, therefore, the sense of self, always being uncomfortable, insecurable, is always haunted or shadowed by a sense of lack, the feeling that something is wrong with me, something isn't quite right. This is another way to understand the fundamental Buddhist teaching, that we misunderstand what the lack is. We think the problem is something out here that we're lacking. It's I don't have enough money, or consumer toys, or I'm not powerful enough, or this or that. We tend to think the fundamental problem is out here, and if only we get enough of this out here, then we'll feel secure and everything will be okay. And what Buddhism is really saying, of course, is no, that's a total misunderstanding of the problem. It has to do with waking up to the true nature, the emptiness of the sense of self, the emptiness of the delusion that there's a me in here somewhere looking out at all of you out there. What does this have to do with economics? Well, I think you can already see, I've already alluded to it. We have a kind of economic system that plays on this fundamental delusion, according to Buddhism. We have an economic system which, by virtue of advertising and its emphasis on economic growth, it has a vested interest in informing us, in persuading us what our problem really is, right? What is our problem? We don't have enough money. That's what it means to grow up in the United States. That's the first thing you learn. You don't have enough money. No matter how much money you have, it doesn't make much difference. You need more money, you need more consumer toys, right? So from a Buddhist perspective, we can understand a very different problem with our economic system. It's not simply that it's not socially just, that it's not fair, although that's certainly true too. Rather, it preys on our delusions. It encourages delusion. It encourages us to think that the very next thing that we buy is what will make us happy. It keeps reeling us in, keeps us thinking that this is the meaning of life. It conditions us to understand ourselves, to identify ourselves as producers, people who earn money, and people who consume. So we can say that there's, unfortunately, an almost perfect fit between this fundamental delusion that Buddhism identifies, that what's wrong with me is something out here that I'm lacking, and the economic system, which preys on that, profits on that, and encourages us to think that way, conditions us to be consumers. Please notice again, I'm not talking about good and evil here. I'm not talking about social justice. I'm not denying that dimension, that we shouldn't have the 1% having so much more than the other 99%. I'm not denying that at all, but I'm saying Buddhism has a very different perspective to offer here. That's the individual. Let me just say a few words, turning it around and looking at the institutionalized side. Well, here's the interesting question. How does what I've just said about the personal predicament that we're encouraged to be consumers, to misunderstand what our sense of lack is, caused by, how does that connect with economic institutions, the structural aspect? It's interesting that the Buddha said very, very little about evil per se. But he said a lot about what is called the three fires, or the three poisons, or the three roots of evil. That is to say, greed, ill will or aggression, and delusion. In fact, this was really essential to the Buddha's revolutionary thinking about karma. Karma was generally, widely, not universally accepted at the time of the Buddha, but it tended to be understood in a kind of formalized way, ritualized way, that if you performed a ceremony, a sacrifice in exactly the right way, the Brahmin priest did it exactly right, then you would get what you were sacrificing for. It tended to be understood in somewhat that way. What the Buddha did, of course, was to ethicize that by emphasizing what really creates karma is our motivations. It's the motivations behind what we do. What I think he's really pointing out is something, again, something so obvious we tend to overlook it, but I think it's a true revolution. He's saying, if you want to transform the quality of your life, if you want to change the way that you experience the world and the way that other people experience and respond to you, there's a very simple way to do that. There's a golden key. Simple, but not necessarily easy. Not necessarily easy. Hopefully not evil. It's transform your motivations. And in fact, I think this is maybe how we can reconstruct or reinterpret karma today, is understanding how our habitual motivations, how to say it? I've talked about the sense of self as a construct, habitual ways of thinking, feeling, acting, and so forth. What are the most important parts of that construct that most immediately relate to how we interact with other people? Motivations, right? Are we motivated in our relationships by greed, ill will, delusion, or are we motivated by generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom? What the Buddha is saying, hey, that's a huge difference. That's going to transform the quality of your life. But getting back to greed, ill will, delusion, today we have not only much more powerful technologies, much more powerful science, but we also have much more powerful institutions. And what I mean by an institution is something that a structure, a social structure that assumes a life of its own with its own motivations, and therefore ends up using our own motivations for its own purposes. I don't think this is something the Buddha had to do with so much. I mean, okay, there's greed, ill will, delusion, but the kind of heavy institutions, formalized legal institutions, they just weren't as strong in his time as they are now. What am I getting at here when I emphasize that institutions take on a life of their own with their own motivations? Well, think about, for example, the CEO of a large transnational corporation. Suppose this person, and let's call him a man, because it usually is, suppose this person becomes very concerned about climate change and wants to do whatever he can to solve the problem of global warming. Well, the problem for him, of course, is that if what he does in response to that threatens corporate profits in any way, he's going to get in trouble. He's likely to lose his job because the way corporations are legally constructed, they're owned and, first of all, responsible to the people the shareholders. And if CEOs do anything to threaten those profits, the shareholders via the board will respond to them. Now, if that's true for the CEO at the top of a transnational corporation, how much more so is it true for everyone else in that corporation down the line who's subordinate to the CEO? I remember Chomsky once said that the only thing more hierarchical than a corporation is the military. Yeah. I think this is a clear example of how an institution can have a life of its own. By the way it's legally structured, you have to play the game to satisfy the investors, and in that way you are very limited as far as the possibilities. You have to fit your own motivations into the motivations of the structure. The corporation ends up using people. The reason I emphasize institutions so much is that I think we have a new problem that the Buddha didn't have to face. The three poisons have become institutionalized. From a Buddhist perspective, I would argue that our economic system is institutionalized greed. Our militarism is institutionalized aggression and ill will. And our media, and even sometimes our educational systems, unfortunately, but certainly our media, institutionalized delusion. Right? Because the corporate media, the major news corporations, which determine what we're informed, what we believe, what we know, they institutionalize delusion because their concern is not to inform us or educate us. Their primary concern, given the way they're structured, is the profits to be derived from advertising and therefore consumerism, rather than actually wanting to teach us or inform us what's really going on. Just to say it again, if I'm right about this, that greed, ill will, and delusion have been institutionalized in this way, and if the Buddha was right in saying that these are the real roots of evil, it's a scary situation, right? In other words, Buddhism, I think, points out the problem in a different way. It's not just social justice, it's not just distributive equity and being fair, but it's actually pointing out something else about the nature of the institutions and how they work. Anyway, let me just conclude by saying a few words about how greed has been institutionalized, because I think that's sort of on all our minds right now. Well, what is greed? One definition is you never have enough. And I think that works not only on a personal level, but it also works on an institutional level, right? It's the nature of corporations, it's the nature of our GNP and GDP, that it can never be large enough. You can never have too much profit. You can never have enough market share. In fact, we can't even imagine what big enough would be. That concept just doesn't work. The whole point is more and more. How much can you get? What am I getting at here? Consider the stock market from two sides. I think from a Buddhist perspective, we could say it functions as a kind of amoral black hole of moral responsibility. I'm serious here. Look at the one side, okay? You have investors, millions and millions of investors, mostly anonymous, who, why are they investing? Is it because they have some special interest in the nature of this corporation? Very rarely. Usually what they're interested in, of course, is profits. And that's all they're interested in. That's all they need to be interested in. That's all the system encourages them to be interested in. In many cases, of course, investors don't even know where their money is because of mutual funds. Now, such people are not evil, of course. This is my point. On the contrary, this is very acceptable. This is something we're encouraged to do. If you have a little bit of extra money, let's invest it in the market. Let's see what we can get out of the market. But look at the other side of that black hole. The general expectations or demands of all these anonymous investors who want returns on their investment. How is this experienced on the other side of this amoral black hole? It's experienced as an unremitting pressure, kind of anonymous pressure, but an unremitting, ongoing pressure, impersonal pressure, anonymous pressure for growth and increased profitability, a pressure that every CEO has to respond to or else they get into trouble. If the CEO's leadership doesn't lead to enough profit, then the investors who own the company are going to give them a hard time. It's just the way that the system is structured. It's not necessarily the case that any of the people in this system are bad people. Please note, that's the point. It's that the system has built into it certain types of motivations, which use our motivations for its own purposes. The globalization of this corporate system means that this emphasis on profitability and growth, of course, is taking over. This is sort of the engine of more and more of all of the world's economic activity, which makes everything else, of course, an externality, what they call externality. In a way, as much as possible, you want to ignore the other consequences by maximizing the profitability. Externalities including not only things like environmental destruction, but also the social consequences involved with, well, offshoring jobs, but also the pressure to transform us, to encourage us to understand and to identify ourselves as producers and especially consumers. Who's responsible for this institutionalized pressure for growth? Well, that's again my point. The system has attained a life of its own. No one's responsible, or everyone's responsible, but in a way that diffuses responsibility in such a kind of anonymous way that it has no responsibility whatsoever. We don't feel it, right? We're all implicated in this system. We all play roles, usually multiple roles within it, as workers, employers, consumers, investors, pensioners, and so forth, but with little, if any, sense of personal responsibility for what the totality of this system is doing. Any awareness of what's going on, of how this system is working, tends to be completely diffused in this impersonal anonymity of the economic process. We're all just doing our job. So that's the other side. I talked a little bit about the personal side, how the tendency to make us into consumers feeds on a misunderstanding of our sense of lack. And also, I think we can see how our economic structures today institutionalize greed. And if the Buddha's right that that's a huge problem, then we have an enormous problem, right? To sum up then, a Buddhist perspective offers a different kind of critique. To say it again, it's not, the argument that I've just given you, it's not in terms of good and bad. Not primarily. It's not in terms of social justice. Rather, it's in terms of dukkha, suffering, and the connection with the delusion of self. Highlighting the way in which these have become institutionalized, of how our ways of thinking have caused us to become trapped in economic processes that we don't understand and that tend to become compulsive. The Buddhist emphasis on greed, quote, never enough, as the first of the three roots of evil implies that when greed becomes institutionalized, it will end up subverting what really needs to be the larger purposes of any good economic system, promoting human happiness. The present economic system works against well-being and biospheric flourishing. We can see that not only from a traditional Western social justice concern, we can see it from a Buddhist perspective. And the one perspective doesn't cancel out the other, but the two together are very important. One reason I think the Buddhist perspective is so important is that if you're only talking about social justice and distributing more, well, you might end up achieving that. You might end up, say, creating a bigger middle class. But from a Buddhist perspective, consumerism, even if it's more egalitarian, is not going to solve the fundamental problem. That we also need to look more deeply at the challenge of personal transformation. This doesn't mean that the solution is to discover or invent the perfect economic system. Lack is there. We're never, as I said before, we're never going to be able to create a system so perfect that people don't have to work in themselves. I'm trying to argue just for the opposite, the need to work on both dimensions. To conclude, I hope you can see that this is a challenge to how the Buddhist tradition has often been understood. It's not enough to focus, as sometimes happens, as often happens, to focus on one's own practice and own personal transformation and own awakening. Leave me alone so I can pursue my own awakening, and then when I'm fully enlightened, I'll do something to help other people. This is not the solution. This dualistic way of thinking is the problem, right? That's not to say that we don't need to spend time by ourselves meditating and so forth, but the idea that I can pursue my own well-being quite separate from the well-being of everyone else, that's the fundamental delusion. The great insight of Buddhism is realizing that insofar as we're part of each other, we cannot do that. Once I begin to wake up and overcome my own dukkha, what I realize is that others' dukkha is also my dukkha. And we also become more aware of how dukkha is not only something personal, but structured institutionally. And this is, I think, the jump, the leap, the development that Western Buddhism or modern Buddhism needs to make. There's the old sociological paradox, people create society, which is why we have to have different people to create different society. But also society creates people. Society creates the people it needs. So we really need to work on both levels, to work to transform ourselves, but also to address and transform the institutions that institutionalize dukkha, that institutionalize greed, aggression, and delusion. Maybe I should stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you. We now have some time for questions and discussion, but I just want to say, with deference to my wife, who couldn't be here this evening, she's always telling me the same thing. David, put in some jokes. You need some good jokes, and I always do the same thing. I say, I don't see where I can fit them in. So I have to apologize to her and to all of you that I couldn't make it more entertaining. It's a pretty heavy, convoluted talk, but I didn't know how to simplify it or to make it more digestible. Anyway, we do have some time for questions, and I believe there's a microphone available for people who want to do that.
You mentioned society and how you mentioned
Yeah.
You mentioned society and how it can transform people and how people can transform society. And then you also mentioned the Mayans and how there was no separation. And then it sounds like we are in that, and I'm questioning where's the earth in that drawing.
Where's the earth and all that? Where's the somatic dimension? I referred to the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians as examples of cultures where there was a kind of seamlessness. The point was, of course, that for them, they tended to take their particular social structure for granted, along with their religion and along with their ecospheres. They're all part of the same thing, right? One consequence of the Greek realization is that we lost the kind of social security that comes from being part of that society, right? Well, okay, it's not always a good thing, right? I mean, think of the Aztecs. They knew who they were. They knew what their function was. They knew that they had to keep the sun on its course by sacrificing large numbers of victims. So we wouldn't like to live in that world. But nonetheless, they didn't have the kind of self-consciousness about asking what kind of society they should have. What kind of society would be a just society, a better society, you see. With the Greek realization that society, human structures are different, that we can remold, we can change ourselves, we can completely reform our society if we want. Along with that, we lose the kind of natural security of being embedded in that way, and we become alienated. We become separate. We feel separate from the earth, and we have this enormous problem. Who are we? Not only individually, but collectively. What does it mean to be human? What's our role on earth? What does it mean to be here? It seems like with our technology, we can do anything we want, but we have less clear idea of what it is that we should be wanting to do. And in consequence, I think we become preoccupied with power as like the means to an end, but we're not able to, I think we're still in this situation of wondering, what does it mean to be human? And I think, in a way, the answer is becoming more and more apparent if we realize our non-duality with the earth. We're going to have lots of meaning. We're going to have lots of stuff to do for generations, maybe for hundreds of years, repairing the rupture between us and the rest of the biosphere. That's going to be a huge job, which will change us as much as the biosphere. Question in the back there, yeah. Can you wait for the microphone? I think it's coming your way.
Is this? Okay.
I think
this makes it a lot more nerve-wracking. But you mentioned, it's possible I didn't understand correctly, but I got the impression you were saying that the early Buddhist doctrine of karma initially operated as both a social and personal sort of call to arms, and then got perverted because of pressures of the state into being simply personal. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, you used the Republic as the example for the West, and I think that's a text that also works on both a social and personal level. And I was wondering if you could talk to what it was about the West, whether it be social pressures or something else, that sort of ended up seeing the Republic as simply a social model.
I was trying to avoid being too committed or too specific about original Buddhism, because the truth is it's very hard to tell. We have the Pali Canon. We also can see lots of things were added, lots of things were changed, and it's very possible, I think likely in my own opinion, that some of the changes had to do with new understandings that would work to the benefit of the Sangha as an institution. So the way that karma became understood as merit-making and so forth. So I don't want to be too strong or too clear about what the Buddha intended. All I know, in a way, is that the way the tradition developed, it had to focus on individual dukkha, individual suffering. It couldn't really address the social and the more institutionalized sides of that. And the point of my talk is to emphasize how we now have those possibilities, which could be understood as a fulfillment or a development of the original teachings. Now, you refer to the Republic. It's quite interesting. There are some Buddhist suttas in the Pali Canon where it's very clear that the Buddha, too, has an understanding of society as a social construct. He criticizes some Brahmin students who have the old myth about how society is structured. And he's very progressive there. I mean, it's an amazing, I'm talking about, I think it's the Aganya Sutta. It's a wonderful sutta, very rich, very sophisticated. And it makes it very clear how, this amazing fact, I think, that 2,500 years ago, the Buddha is talking about constructivism, how, society is a construct that therefore can be reconstructed. And likewise, all this talk about skandhas and conditioned genesis, it's all about samskaras, it's all about constructs. But the difference is simply, I think, that element was not developed in the same way for whatever reason. It didn't catch on. And maybe it was only because Plato was writing the Republic in this time, this sort of beginnings of democracy within Athens, that there was the possibility so that this vision of possible transformation, the idea that we can have these new visions of how society might be structured, this caught on and became more fundamental to the Western tradition than it did to the Asian tradition or the Buddhist tradition. Or so it seems to me. That would be the point that I would make. A couple in the back of the room. One more. Are we out of time? Oh dear. That means I talk too much. Okay, this might be the last question, although if anyone really wants to pursue it, I'm happy to hang around a bit afterwards. We can talk among ourselves.
I hope it's a good question here. If it's the last question. You spoke so well about the desirability, the necessity, the urgency for these two different perspectives to commingle and produce overall more beneficial and fully functioning movement towards a better world. Excuse me. I have a question here. It's fairly the perspective of social justice and what you described as grown and well-defined in the West, as compared to the perspective of personal transcendence of the self. Yes, it's a mental construct, but it's programmed not to be forgotten. And in terms of my own experience, as a person who has both spent a great deal of time on the Buddhist path of self-transformation, and somewhat dabbled in the world of social, political, economic, environmental activism, it seems to me that the ability, the capacity, and the work to transcend oneself, to grow beyond one's self-centeredness, is enormously more difficult. So how does that work? It's pretty easy, relatively speaking, it seems to me, to identify some injustice and problems, environmental problems, relatively easy, and then to make some strategies. And it's easy to generate interest, relatively so, but boy, to get down to the work of understanding my own motives, my own mind, my own assumptions, opinions, prejudice, my own, finally, my own deeply, deeply profound delusions of the nature of myself, that seems to me incredibly more demanding. And so, can these come together that easily?
My sense is that they're both extremely difficult, both sides. Certainly, I don't deny what you said about the process of working and truly transforming oneself, but maybe the process of social transformation looks relatively easy to us because we're at the crest of it. We're experiencing the result of it, you know. I mean, when I think of you go back historically and you look at the incredible movements and the suffering and the efforts that went, anti-slavery movement in England and later the Civil War in the U.S., I don't think these were easy accomplishments. I think that to an extent it's dangerous. We shouldn't take this for granted. It's the fruit of hundreds of years and the sacrifice of the selfless sacrifice, devotion of millions of people working toward this that we are today benefiting from. And I mean, I think both of them are exceedingly difficult, and also both of them are exceedingly important. In fact, the most important things, right? It's like it's getting to the point, it's getting more obvious. This is the only game in town. This is what we all have to be doing. We have to be working both on ourselves, on our own individual egos and delusions and so forth, but also we have to contribute to this great social economic challenge that we're experiencing today, which, thanks to Occupy Wall Street, you know, we see something is happening. You know, people, they don't necessarily know what's motivating them, but they know the present system isn't working, and that's huge. It's only in the last couple years that I think a very large number, if not a majority of people, are finally waking up to the fact that this system, far from being the best system or the only possible system, in fact, it's not working very well at all. That's huge. That opens so many doors. But I think it's going to take a lot of hard work on all of our parts to walk through those doors and to develop those possibilities. So I think there's plenty for keeping us all busy. Thank you very much.